We tend to think about our digital lives in terms of code, platforms, and apps. But running underneath all of that is a kind of legal architecture, a whole system of rules that's trying, and often struggling, to keep up with technology. So, how do we actually build a legal framework for a reality that is becoming more and more virtual? This explainer, which is based on the work of Professor Vihar Kishkinov, is going to explore that very question.
All right, here's the path we're going to take. First, we'll look at how this virtual legal reality even gets formed. Then, we'll break down its composition and look at the unique nature of its rules. From there, we'll see how these rules get bundled together into larger structures, and we'll finish up by looking at how the very operation of law is changing. So let's start with formation.
So, our first question is a really fundamental one. When you're building a legal system for the online world, where do you even begin? And that question sparks a huge debate about the best way to approach it.
At the very heart of this discussion is one critical question: who's in the driver's seat? Should the tech experts go first, build their platforms, and then have lawyers come in later to try and stretch existing laws to fit? Or should the lawyers design the legal blueprint from the start and then have the technologists build according to those rules?
This leads to two pretty different philosophies. The technology-oriented approach is what you'd call reactive. It basically lets innovation lead the way, and then the law is always playing catch-up, trying to patch old rules onto new situations. The legal-oriented approach, on the other hand, is proactive. It starts by designing a new legal model specifically built for the virtual world, which then acts as a guide for how the technology should be developed. But, it's not quite that simple. This black and white picture gets a bit more nuanced. Beyond just reactive and proactive, you've got a unified model, which is a more mature approach where lawyers and tech folks work together right from the beginning. And then there's the one we see a lot in the real world, the de facto model, where huge global platforms just make their own rules through their terms of service, which basically forces governments to step in and regulate after the fact.
Okay, so now that we've looked at the different ways this reality can be formed, let's dig into its composition. What are the actual building blocks and blueprints that make up virtual law? You can think of virtual legal reality as having two main parts. First, there's the prescriptive part. This is the concrete stuff, the actual legal rules, the electronic registers, the identification tools. Then there's the conceptual part. This is like the intellectual engine, the theories, models, and doctrines that give all those prescriptive rules their meaning and direction. Diving a little deeper into that prescriptive part, we find what's called the constructive mechanism. Think of this as the essential infrastructure, the plumbing of the system. It's things like digital representations of people and companies, secure electronic registers that store legal facts, trusted ways to identify yourself like a qualified electronic signature, and secure spaces to exchange legally binding documents. And running on top of that whole infrastructure is the regulatory mechanism. These are the dynamic processes that happen. We're talking about all the procedures for things like e-justice and e-government, as well as standardized models for how we interact online, like smart contracts that automatically carry out the terms of an agreement. Okay, so we've got the overall structure down. Now let's zoom in on the most fundamental unit of law, the legal norm, or basically, the rule. We really need to understand how these basic rules get completely reimagined in a digital world. And this is where you see the core evolution. A traditional legal norm, it's just a rule of conduct for people. But a virtual legal norm has this fascinating dual role. It's a rule for people, and it's a design specification for the technology. It tells us how electronic registers, online court proceedings, and other systems have to be built and how they have to work. This dual function gives these virtual norms some really unique characteristics that set them apart from their old-school analog counterparts. So let's explore what exactly makes them so special. We can really boil down their uniqueness to three things. First, they have a new ontology, meaning they exist and come to life in a virtual environment. They have a new way of acting because they regulate relationships that are specific to that environment, like registering a domain name. And, most importantly, they have a new mechanism of action because they're implemented directly through information technology. Now, this new mechanism of action gives rise to a truly revolutionary idea: the self-executing norm. With these kinds of rules, following the rule is literally built into the code. The system doesn't just punish you for breaking a rule, it makes it technically impossible to break it in the first place. A smart contract that automatically moves money once certain conditions are met, that's a perfect example. So if these individual norms are like atoms, the next logical step is to see how they're put together into larger, more complex structures,
the molecules of our virtual legal world. And these are known as legal constructions. See, a single rule can handle a simple action, no problem. But to govern really complex activities, the law uses these legal constructions. Think of them as systematic combinations of legal norms, guiding principles, and tech elements that all work together to create a complete, functional institution or process.
Let's look at some real examples to make this clear. An electronic ID system isn't just one rule. It's a whole construction of regulations, cryptographic protocols, and oversight bodies. The same is true for an electronic business register. And we're also seeing new digitally native constructions pop up, like decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, which are run by rules that are coded directly onto a blockchain.
This brings us to our final section, and you could argue it's the most profound change of all. We're going to look at how this technological approach fundamentally changes the way law actually operates and enforces itself.
The really crucial point is this major shift in enforcement. Traditional law mostly works ex post, which means after the fact. Somebody breaks a rule, and then a penalty is applied. But in the virtual world, law can work ex ante, before the fact. The technology is designed from the ground up so that the violation is prevented from ever even happening. The whole focus shifts from punishment to prevention by design.
But not all automation is the same. It's really important to distinguish between deterministic action, where technology is just a passive tool following a preset script, and probabilistic action. This is where AI gets involved, acting with adaptive autonomy. It's not just executing commands, it's generating decisions on its own, within a legal framework that humans have set.
Of course, this all brings a pretty big risk with it, something called regulatory distortion. This is what happens when the logic of the computer code doesn't perfectly capture the spirit of the law. You can get a mismatch between the legal goal and how it's actually implemented technically, which creates a need for a kind of legal debugging to make sure the tech is actually doing what the law intended.
So, to wrap up our journey here, we've seen that virtual legal reality is built from both these concrete, prescriptive parts and the more abstract, conceptual parts. Its core legal rules are put into action directly through technology. This automates legal processes and, maybe most importantly, shifts the whole idea of enforcement from reaction to prevention.
And all of this leaves us with a final, really thought-provoking question to consider. As we continue to embed our legal rules directly into the architecture of our digital world, we have to ask ourselves, when the law is written in code, who becomes the ultimate judge, the court or the programmer?